Okay, so we're going to be diving into some pretty deep waters today
Yeah?
with this one, Rooting Out Rejection and Hidden Bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
Just the title kind of packs a punch.
Yeah, you're not alone if you just want to kind of like
Yeah.
tiptoe away from this one.
Right.
It's raw, it's intense, but I think that's why we're here,
Yeah.
to take this booklet from Win Worley and break down what are those big takeaways.
Absolutely.
You know, you're right about the title, though. It is something that I think we as humans, we try to avoid it. We keep it hidden.
Right.
But that word rooting, that's important here
Yeah.
because it's suggesting something way deeper than just feeling sad or hurt.
Yeah, you said it. It's like he's saying like that surface level stuff, like the anger, the withdrawal. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
And we all know what happens when you ignore the part you can't see.
Oh, it gets messy fast.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this whole rejection tree analogy that he uses, I think, is so helpful.
Yeah.
The outward stuff, those are just the leaves. You can trim them back all you want, but they're going to keep growing back until you deal with the root.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting to me.
Okay.
He says that even perceived rejection messes us up.
Yeah.
Like, even if no one meant to reject us.
Right.
That's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
It is. And it explains so much of how we interact with the world around us. Because it's not just about what actually happens to us, right?
Right.
It's about the lens we're viewing it through. It's those past hurts, those insecurities.
Yeah.
They become these filters that warp our perception.
So, like, I might be at a party and everyone's having a good time, but my brain is going, see, they're all talking over there. They don't even notice you.
Right.
Even if it's not true.
Exactly. And because our brains are hardwired for survival, right? They are scanning for threats. They are scanning for potential rejection.
Right.
It's like that old saying, we hear what we expect to hear. So even a neutral comment can feel like a personal attack if we're already expecting rejection.
And what I found so fascinating is how far back he traces this.
Yes.
He's talking about childhood wounds and family dynamics, even stuff like perceived favoritism between siblings.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much of that early stuff are we all carrying around without even realizing it?
And here's where he connects it to this concept of inherited spiritual burdens.
Okay.
Now, that might sound a bit abstract, but stick with me for a second.
Okay.
Essentially, what he's saying is that these patterns of rejection, these wounds, they can be passed down through families, even unintentionally.
Wow.
Almost like a family inheritance. It's like those generational curses you hear about. But instead of some supernatural force, it's the very human pain and dysfunction that gets repeated.
Okay, so that's heavy stuff,
Yeah.
but it makes a strange kind of sense, right?
Yeah.
Like if you grow up and you see a parent who's struggling with feeling unloved, you might pick up on those same patterns, those same insecurities.
And those patterns then impact how we form attachments, how we view ourselves, how we interact with the world. It's like those early experiences create this template for how we expect to be treated.
It's almost like we're programmed to expect the worst, even when there's no evidence to support it.
Exactly. And then because we're expecting it, we might even subconsciously behave in ways that bring about the very rejection we're afraid of.
Oh, wow.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's like we're setting ourselves up for heartbreak before we even give anyone a chance.
And that's why it's so important to identify these patterns, these roots of rejection, so we can start to break free from those cycles and create healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
And he doesn't shy away from the extreme examples either.
No, he doesn't.
He talks about the story of Cain and Abel, how jealousy and perceived rejection festered into this intense bitterness that ultimately led to murder.
Right. And while that's obviously an extreme case, I think it illustrates the destructive power of unaddressed bitterness.
Yeah.
And Worley makes this chilling point. He says, anger and the bitterness it generates will always be accompanied by a spirit of murder.
Okay, now that's heavy stuff. But he's not just talking about physical violence, is he?
Right. Think of it more like a destructive force, something that eats away at us from the inside. We murder our own potential, our relationships, our joy, all because we're clinging to that bitterness. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Whoa. You know, when you put it like that, it really makes you realize how self-destructive bitterness can be.
Exactly. And that's why he doesn't just leave us in that place of despair. He offers hope. He talks about how, just as the Israelites found bitter water at Marah,
Right.
we too encounter those bitter waters in life, those disappointments, those betrayals, those moments that leave us feeling disillusioned and disheartened.
But then remember what happened. God showed Moses a tree to throw in the water, and it became sweet.
And that, my friend, is where Worley brings in this beautiful analogy of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
He sees the tree as a symbol of Christ's
Right.
sacrifice, a sacrifice that has the power to sweeten even the bitterest waters of our lives.
It's like those bitter experiences, those rejections, those hurts, they don't just disappear, but they can be transformed.
Yeah.
It's like God takes those lemons and makes lemonade.
Exactly. But here's the thing. We have to be willing to let go of the bitterness to surrender it to Him.
Yeah.
And that, as Worley points out, can be easier said than done.
Especially when we feel justified in our bitterness, right? Like, hey, I was wronged. They hurt me. I deserve to be angry.
And Worley gets that. But he challenges us to consider a different perspective.
Okay.
He talks about this second mile mindset. It's about choosing a response that goes beyond just reacting to what's been done to us.
It's like instead of plotting our revenge, we're choosing to take a totally different path.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that path, as Worley describes it, isn't about being passive or letting people walk all over us. It's about shifting our focus from retaliation to transformation.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Because honestly, turn the other cheek sounds great in theory, but in the heat of the moment.
Right. It's not always easy.
Yeah.
And Worley doesn't pretend that it is.
Mm-hmm.
He reminds us that we're in a spiritual battle here,
Mm-hmm.
and the battlefield. It's our own minds and hearts.
So not battling other people, but battling those negative thought patterns, those urges to lash out, to withdraw, to let bitterness take root.
Precisely. See, those forces that Worley talks about, they thrive on keeping us stuck in those cycles of hurt and blame.
Yeah.
A whisper in our ear, you're justified in your anger. They deserve your bitterness.
It's like they're trying to hijack our healing by making us think that holding on to bitterness is somehow giving us power.
And the irony is, it's actually robbing us of power. Power to live fully, to love freely, to experience the joy and peace that come from forgiveness.
It's like we're trading a prison cell for a palace, but sometimes that cell feels safer because it's what we're used to.
That's a powerful image. And Worley, he gets real about how insidious this stuff can be, especially for people in ministry.
Yeah.
He talks about how pastors, counselors, anyone who's constantly pouring themselves out for others,
Right.
they're especially vulnerable to bitterness.
Because they're dealing with difficult people and heavy situations all the time. It's like, how much can one person take before they start to crack?
Exactly. Worley talks about this feeling of how many more people are there whose lives are in such a mess?
Yeah.
That sense of being overwhelmed, of feeling like it's just too much to bear.
Yeah.
And in those moments, it's so tempting to become cynical, jaded, to question God even.
It's almost like that bitterness becomes a defense mechanism. Like if we build up these walls around our hearts, then nobody can hurt us again. But the problem is we also can't experience true connection, true joy when we're all walled up.
And that's where things can spiral. Because Worley doesn't just leave it at the emotional and spiritual level. He draws this direct link between bitterness and physical health.
You're talking about that line where he says, behind almost every infirmity of the body, look for the primary roots of bitterness.
That's the one. That might sound extreme, but think about it. When we're constantly stressed, resentful, holding on to anger, our bodies are flooded with cortisol, adrenaline, all those stress hormones that wreak havoc on our systems.
So it's not just some woo-woo spiritual concept. There's actual science backing this up. Like, our emotional and physical health are totally intertwined. It's like that other quote, unforgiveness is like letting someone live rent-free in your head, except they're not just living there, they're trashing the place.
And we're the ones stuck cleaning up the mess, which is why Worley is such a proponent of forgiveness, not as some easy button, but as a deliberate act of choosing to release the offense to reclaim our power.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Because it's one thing to say, I forgive you, but how do we get to a place where we genuinely mean it?
Worley outlines some practical steps, and it starts with honesty. We have to acknowledge our own bitterness, confess it to God, and maybe even to a trusted friend or counselor. Get those feelings out in the open where they can't fester.
And then what? Because sometimes, even after we've confessed it, we still feel stuck.
That's where the choice comes in. Worley says we have to choose to forgive even when we don't feel like it. It's an act of the will, a decision we make to release the other person from their debt, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve freedom.
It's like we're choosing to set ourselves free from that bitterness, from that cycle of resentment and anger.
And sometimes that means setting boundaries too. Worley is clear that forgiveness doesn't equal reconciliation. We can choose to forgive someone without putting ourselves back in a position to be hurt again.
That's a really important distinction because I think sometimes people get confused about that. They think forgiveness means just letting the person back into their lives, no questions asked.
And that's not what Worley's advocating at all. It's about releasing the offense, not necessarily the offender. And sometimes that release involves putting healthy boundaries in place.
So it's about taking back our power, but not in like a vengeful way, right?
Yes,
It's about reclaiming our peace of mind, our well-being.
exactly. And Worley reminds us that forgiveness isn't just about like us and the person who hurt us.
Right.
There's like a ripple effect.
You're talking about how our bitterness or unforgiveness, it can like impact the people around us too.
It's like a poison that seeps into everything we touch. Think about it when we're carrying around all that anger and resentment.
Yeah.
It's going to color our interactions with everyone, even the people we love most.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
We end up perpetuating this cycle of pain instead of breaking free from it.
And on the flip side, when we choose forgiveness, when we choose to release that bitterness,
Yeah.
it creates space for healing, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of those around us.
Mm-hmm.
It's like planting a garden where there was once a wasteland.
It's about creating a legacy of healing for ourselves and for generations to come. And that brings us back to that incredible story that he shares about the party man.
Yes.
This guy who was so lost in his own pain, his own destructive behaviors, it seemed like there was no hope for him.
And yet, through the love and acceptance, he found he was able to confront those deep-seated wounds of rejection and bitterness and find true healing.
Wow.
It's a powerful reminder that no matter how far gone we think we are, no matter how deep those wounds may seem, God's love is always there beckoning us towards wholeness.
It's like even in the darkest of places, there's always a flicker of light.
And sometimes all it takes is one person, one act of kindness, one moment of grace to ignite that flicker into a flame.
And that flame, that's what Worley is trying to ignite in all of us with this booklet.
Right.
He's calling us to step out of the shadows of our own bitterness and into the light of God's healing love.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some final thoughts we can leave our listeners with? What's the one thing we want them to remember?
I think it comes down to this. You are not defined by your wounds. You're not defined by the rejection or bitterness you've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
You are defined by the love that God has for you.
Yeah.
A love that has the power to heal even the deepest parts of you. It's about remembering that you are worthy of love, worthy of healing. And those struggles, those things you might be tempted to see as weaknesses or failures, what if they're actually invitations? Invitations to experience God's grace in a deeper way, to draw closer to Him, and to discover the incredible strength that comes from embracing your own vulnerability.
Beautifully said. And as we've seen through Worley's words, that journey, though it may be challenging at times, is a journey worth taking. Because on the other side of that pain, on the other side of that bitterness, lies a freedom and a joy that are more beautiful and more fulfilling than we could ever imagine.
So to our listener, we leave you with this. Don't be afraid to face those hidden places, those roots of rejection and bitterness that may be holding you back. Bring them into the light. Let God's love shine on them and wash as He transforms them into something beautiful. You are not alone on this journey.